We will restart the plenary, and this morning and this afternoon we have still a few very interesting sessions in the plenary, and we start actually with the one on the community scenarios. And yeah, community scenarios are at the heart of the IMC. The organization was originally founded on request of the IPCC, asking for the contribution of new scenarios, which could not be done by IPCC itself anymore. And the IMC responded by creating itself and creating the RCPs. And since then, working on community scenarios has remained one of the most important activities also from the IMC. And one of them was our work on the SSPs. We obviously also are working with scenarios in collaboration with IPCC. And so in this session, we would like to reflect a bit on where we are with community scenarios, what needs to be done in the future. And also we want to give an overview of where we are in potentially updating the SSPs. Some of the presentations might overlap a little bit with presentations that have already been presented in some of the parallel sessions. But I think these presentations are important enough to also share with the VUU community. Yeah, I would at this point of time give the floor to Jim SKEA from IPCC Working Group 3, the chair of IPCC Working Group 3, and to make some reflections on how scenarios were used in the sixth assessment report, and also maybe have some ideas of how they could be used in the seventh assessment report.
Okay, thanks, Detlef. And just to say, I don't have any slides because they only get me into trouble. So I'm just going to do this verbally. I was actually thinking back to a workshop that was here at the University of Maryland quite early in the sixth assessment cycle. It wasn't a full IAMC meeting. Just after the Paris Agreement was signed. And Trig Talley, the US focal point, came out here and spoke to us as part of the session. And he congratulated the integrated assessment modelers and said, this is going to be your place in the sun for the next 5 years. You are going to be really, really influential. And I think the experience has absolutely shown out just what kind of influence this community has had on the discourse at the international level about climate change. The concepts of net zero, keeping 1.5 alive, etc. All of this community has played a very key role in developing that wider agenda. And just to say also, I think in terms of the vigor of the community, I mean, there's an awful lot of activity that has been showcased here. But I wanted to mention also the scenarios database, because it also triggers a whole secondary research activity, interpreting and distilling the results from that is also, I think, been really important as well. So I wanted to start with these very positive things, because as always, when you're a co-chair at the end of the cycle, you're thinking about the things you could have done just a little bit better. And I'm going to focus just a little bit on the buts as well. So just first to say on transparency, I think transparency of modelling and scenarios has improved a great deal during this cycle, though it still has some way to go. In the IPCC report, we had a full annex on scenarios and modelling methodology, which I think is important. If we're being a little bit self-critical about it, it probably spoke more to fellow modellers than it did to model users, which I think is something that might need attention in the future. And also the scenarios database itself, the AR6 database, included much more information on input assumptions to scenarios, which was a big part of the critiques that were coming from the outside. So I think that has been important. One thing on the transparency requirement, the greater requirements for data that we need to pay a little bit of attention to, anecdotal evidence that this has raised the hurdle for actually the amount of work that is needed to prepare a scenario to put it into the database. So there may be, trade-offs between transparency and some degrees of inclusivity. Now, a few of my remarks coming on are going to be about inclusivity. There's a slide here that's very unpopular, especially with Keywan, actually, which we'll get on to, noting that there are about 5 models that account for more than 75% of the scenarios in the database. And I think this does need some attention in the future about getting inclusivity. One particular thing that was also concerning from the point of view of the Working Group 3 co-chairs was the fact that more than 90% of the scenarios in the database that were submitted came from SSP2, the middle of the road SSP. Now, why did that matter? It mattered because one of the messages coming out of AR6 in this cycle was that incremental change isn't enough. And at the end, we made that case in quite a qualitative kind of way. Had there been more scenarios based on SSP1, we could have quantified that and developed a second line of evidence to support it that I think would have been quite important. So again, I think, messages to the community. Let's think about a wider range of scenarios that might go in there. And I would also add on that point, one of the big battles that took place at the Working Group 3 approval was about the question of equity and where that fits in scenario design. In fact, with at COP27, there were a couple of interesting side events and where this question of equity came along. How you build equity into scenario design from the beginning, from the perspective of a wider range of stakeholders, I think is potentially an issue for AR7 and beyond. Now, one other thing I wanted to flag about was the question, this partly ties into the concentration of a large number of models, is the use of statistical techniques, 90% ranges, interquartile ranges, etc., to characterize what was submitted in the database. And it is a statistical kind of methodology, but perhaps it's a little bit of a pseudo-statistical approach, given the concentration in particular numbers of models. And one of the things that we've done as a kind of thought experiment is how you would write the IAM chapter in IPCC if the scenario database did not exist. And what you would do probably is pay more attention to the model intercomparison projects and the publications that have arisen from them, and perhaps taken a more focused approach. And you still could do that with a scenarios database. Many of these MIPs have asked really interesting policy relevant questions, which I think on reflection might have been drawn out a bit more in the IEM chapter of the report. And I know Jay Edmonds and others would emphasize the importance of not just doing it by MIPS, but by having individual teams taking much more guerrilla approaches to the future, if I can put it that way, rather than these big organized processes. Just a couple of things I want to flag on process issues that we found there, and this is very much from the point of view of the TSU and the co-chairs. The role of the cutoff date for literature and scenarios, which was only 7 weeks before the final government draft was sent out. This was a major challenge in terms of the workload and for the people, both for our people and for the people in the relevant chapter. And the consequences were, dare I say it, some errors crept into the process because of the speed with which it was made. Perhaps some of the decisions were made, including the use of the codes that I think that people have talked about here, were not really documented. So when we've put together the synthesis report, we find people are rerunning the codes and getting different answers, and we are trying to reconcile that. This is a challenge that we need to look to. And it also meant, because it came in at a very late date, there were limited opportunities to socialize scenarios across the different chapters of the report. So I think this is a challenge we need to think about, and I will come on to that about the scenarios workshop IPCC will be running. And just a general point as well is about the boundary between what is research that's done by the community and assessment that's done by the people who are appointed as authors. Sometimes it's very much the same people, you know, on the IAMC Council, in the Chapter 3 that produce the scenarios, conducting the research. And I think we do need to pay some attention to that kind of inclusivity and spread it out. And can I just say what a good job I think the Japanese colleagues do in spreading the AIM model throughout the Asia Pacific region. I think there's some lessons that could actually be learned there. So the working group co-chairs from all 3 working groups, all 6 of us, proposed an expert meeting on scenarios before the 6th assessment cycle came to an end in order to take stock of what we did in AR6 and perhaps work up recommendations for AR7. And when we put that to governments in plenary, they were so excited by it, they elevated it from an expert meeting to a workshop, which means that they get to nominate the participants. And just right at this moment, we have a scientific steering committee that a meeting next week will be looking at these nominations to try to work on the selection. So there will be about 120 people there, and the meeting will take place in Bangkok on the 25th to the 27th of April, and it will take place in the UN, the headquarters of the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. So a nice UN neutral venue in a country that does not dominate the scenario production process, a deliberate aim. So in terms of the scientific aims, it will take stock of the contributions of scenarios to the AR6 process. It would identify gaps, any gaps in the AR6 scenario approach, taking account of user needs. And it would consider how best to build on the RCP SSP framework adopted in AR6 and think about possible scenario architectures for IPCC in the 7th cycle and beyond. And just a message, of course, there's a big messy world out there with lots of scenarios. To communicate scenarios to governments and other users through IPCC, there's a real need for distillation. And at the Working Group 1 approval, there was a very strong message that governments wanted simplicity. They took all this RCP, SSP stuff, cut through it and said, we're going to call them very low, low, medium, high, and very high. That was the kind of simplicity they were looking for. And I do think we need to think about that. We need to have some process aims as well to consider how to develop cross-working group collaboration on scenarios, which was excellent between working groups 1 and 3, could be enhanced, I think, a little bit with working group 2. And to address any improvements in the mechanisms for developing, applying and curating scenarios data. And that's a conversation I think we need to have with IAMC and IIASA about the degree to which the scenario database is owned by the community or whether it's an IPCC kind of installation. I should say our legal counsel does not think that our memorandum of understanding would stand up in any legal process. So, we do need to actually, which was deliberately the intention. We wanted to keep it away from lawyers as much as possible. And also, I think in process to think about how the diversity of contributions to scenario building process could be improved. So these are broadly speaking the objectives. I've probably gone over time, Detlef, so I'll stop here. But let me end on the very positive remarks. Honestly, the integrated assessment modeling community has had a truly significant impact on global thinking about climate change. You can see its fingers all across the global stocktake process and the second periodic review of the long-term goal of the convention. It was really influential. So well done, guys. Good job. Just keep it up.
Thank you, Jim. The second speaker is Bas van Ruijven, who will reflect on some of the insights of the scenario forum on scenario development.
Yeah, thanks. And so to briefly remind everyone that we had a scenarios forum for those who have been living under a rock over the past year, because I think we bombarded the IAM community quite a bit with our emails and announcements. But we had it in June this year. We had more than 500 people actually participating in person and online, right? About 300 there. And the enormous amount of 45 parallel sessions, which no one was able to actually digest and process. And so also want to announce here basically that since last week, all of the recorded sessions are available online. So if you want to binge over your holiday break, go watch 2 weeks of scenario forum discussions. The goal for bringing everyone together for a second time after the 2019 Scenarios Forum was still to create this community, to have a platform across the different communities, the IM community, the impacts community, the climate modeling community, to discuss how we use and develop scenarios on the community level. So many of the steering committee people that we had for that meeting are here, but I put this up to see that we had to show that we had a quite large steering committee, reflecting basically the enormous broad use of the scenarios across many different scientific disciplines and communities that we have, and so you need a lot of people to cover all of that ground. So a few key highlights. We asked basically all of the session organizers for their feedback and what came out of the sessions. And and so there's a few positive things, and then there's things where people find as challenges, and then synthesizing those as how we want to go forward with those. So first, the key highlights, I think, is that the SSP-RCP framework continues to be really widely used in many applications, and also very increasingly outside of the climate community and outside of the direct sustainability communities. And it's still really growing in its application. People are still discovering the enormous amount of data that are in the framework and are available for people. It really helps to facilitate a lot of research. I mean, the research is exploding. If you look at the literature databases that we try to keep track of, that in itself is becoming a difficult task. But also new extensions are emerging on those aspects that were not originally covered. And the original aim of the framework to also facilitate assessment. We also see that actually worked in AR6 in IPBES as well, with some challenges for individual working groups that also became clear in the discussions during the forum. Then in terms of hearing back from the community, what kind of feedback, lack of centrally available, kind of all of this granular information and quantifications is actually really hard to find. We have sort of a tension between, on the one hand, missing perspectives, as well as having too many scenarios for people to use them. In the end, people revert to SSP2, as Jim already alluded to, but at the same time want more perspectives in the scenarios. And so we're not going to run 7, 8, or 10 SSPs. After working with it for a first round, it looks like we actually focus a lot on baseline uncertainty and mapping sort of positive towards negative, right? SSP1, everything is positive. SSP3, everything goes negative, and your insights sort of are mapped with the SSPs, and we need to free that up and have more attention for solution strategies across SSPs. There's always something out of date, either socioeconomics or climate when you use it, and that's inherent to the way we do this, but it's still a hindering feature. There is a big debate on unlikely combinations of SSPs and RCPs. On the global level, this is a debate you can have. On the local level, actually, people said there is still these are still useful combinations sometimes to have. And then there's the tension between research input for individual studies and this need for consistent scenarios for assessment needs, integrating impact and mitigation and everything in a consistent way. On the one hand, building blocks, on the other hand, sort of key marker scenarios that integrate everything. I think I need to speed up a little bit. So I put this up here. One thing around bad practices is the thing that actually emerged coming out of CMIP 6 in the labeling and the interpretation of people looking at that labeling. In scenario MIP, basically the labeling is on SSP-RCP combinations. So SSP2, 4.5. And what we see is that many users interpret that as a matching of the socioeconomics with the climate. Basically going back to SRES times where the socioeconomic and the climate were matched and not having those decoupled. And this is was not the intention. It's not the intention of CMIP6 and scenario MIP. It's really in the interpretation of users, and that's something we should really warn against. Yeah, so a few proposed next steps on how to go forward here. Freeing up the baseline uncertainty from the solution strategies is something we need to think about how we can actually do that. So go into like not the socioeconomic and climate dimension of the matrix of the SPS RCP framework we have. Think of that third dimension, basically what was the policy dimension, but free it up and broaden it into solution strategies and assess those against different baseline uncertainties on the socioeconomic side. Will a demand entry point work under SSP3, or are you too vulnerable, for example? Or do you always map that to your SSP1 because that's what you where you expect that to work? Broaden the framing so that it's not about challenges to mitigation adaptation, but actually go to preventive or proactive versus responsive on the axes, so that it's easier to connect to other communities. Also develop more of these community tools. There was a discussion just in the scenarios working group here on impact emulators and how we can actually improve the information being exchanged between the different communities. There is a clear need for additional scenarios, especially on the post-growth domain, regional sustainability. There is a clear user voice that we need something there, and the communication about the building blocks and how we develop a baseline scenario that you then can use in assessments for impacts and mitigations is proving to be very challenging for people to understand that. People still keep sort of referring to baselines without impacts, without mitigation as sort of a scenario to be used, where it's actually just a methodological step that you need that, but you don't need to use it for your policy advice. And we need to think about our high-end scenarios. RCP 8.5 is clearly outdated, but then where is it and how do we define high-end scenarios? So that's it. There's a few follow-ups, but that's been discussed already this week. Let me hand over to the next speaker. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bas. The next speaker is Keywan RIAHI from IIASA, and he will reflect on some of the tools that were developed for the AR6 assessment and how potentially they're also used in the future.
Can I have the other slides, please?
Or you should do Samir's presentation.
Yeah, this will be tough. I should. Yeah. Excuse me. This is
Mr. RIAHI.
Where are the technicians? Great, thank you very much. Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit about basically the scenario infrastructure and the explorers which have enabled so many different community activities and modeling comparisons. And one of those recent ones, so there are many different scenario explorers in many different projects that have been established throughout the years and helped us basically to collaborate and compare our scenario results. And I would think it also helped us actually to grow the community. And the most recent one is the one of the AR6, the IPCC AR6, where we are hosting the data and increase the transparency, but at the same time also we're providing the writing team with the with a tool to basically collect the scenario data and also to compare the scenarios data, which is absolutely necessary because we have thousands of scenarios meanwhile, and we have to do this in a systematic way. So it was really nice to have this memorandum of understanding, which this non-legally binding memorandum of understanding with the IPCC, and could establish this collaboration. In the meantime, there are actually 10,000 of unique hits every month. And we have many gigabytes of data downloads of the IPCC data. So the interest in the IEM scenario information underlying the AR6 is vast. A few changes perhaps that happened in the AR6 compared to the earlier one, the earlier assessment is, for example, the increasing participation and diversity of modeling teams. So in the SR 1.5, we had in total 20 IEM modeling teams underlying the SR 1.5 database who submitted scenarios. And this completely changed in AR6. So we not only more than doubled the number of global models who participated, actually the global models are in the minority. So there were more national models, more subnational models, and more sectoral models who submitted results to the IPCC database than the global models. And another really important success, I would say, in terms of increasing the diversity of the community is if you look into how many new modeling teams have been on board. So more than 50% of all the modeling teams in the IPCC database are actually newcomers who for the first time have submitted scenarios to the database. So we have a 5 times increase in terms of the scenarios. And to some extent also, I think that's a really important difference compared to the SR 1.5, a much more systematic exploration of the solution space because of large scale modeling comparisons, where multiple models tried to run really the integrated assessment models up to the feasibility frontier and help to understand are really low targets like the 1.5 degree feasible or not. In order to assess this question, you need to run multiple models with a standardized modeling comparison project, and that is also the reason why, for example, some of the projects contributed over proportionally large number of scenarios to the database. Yeah, so one other element that I think was important for AR6 was that to the effort of many different colleagues also in the room here, we could establish a pipeline that connects basically the analytical work and the climate assessment in Working Group 1 directly with the scenarios in Working Group 3. And to that, we could build a bridge and increase the consistency across the two communities. That was not the case earlier on, which is extremely important, I think. It's also important for cross-community building. So I would say the many meetings with Working Group 1 colleagues really helped us to understand also the challenges which are on the other side and to basically work very closely together. We have also increased the transparency, and all the tools that have been developed can be further used by everybody who develops at the moment scenarios. So it's not only transparent, but it's also reproducible and adaptable. So that's, I think, was an important feature that we achieved with the Working Group 1 colleagues together. And for the future, I think the big question is, can we do similar linkages? Can we establish similar linkages in collaboration with Working Group 2? And we just had a session on scenarios where the idea of impact emulators were discussed. So I think we can try, and it would provide a huge utility if we can establish similar linkages with the Working Group 2 community, where you have emulators that are, for example, calibrated based on the recent impact literature, which are, for example, assessed in the communities, and try in a rigorous and an analytical way also establish those linkages in terms of impacts, and also think about who is the group with whom we would actually collaborate in order to establish those linkages, and can we set priorities for AR7 so that a similar success story can also be followed in AR7 between perhaps working group 2 and working group 3. I would say another new challenge for our community is, and some of you might have heard this part of my presentation already that I gave at the Scenario Forum, is that we are living in a rapidly changing policy and technology environment. And this is very difficult for the integrated assessment for our community to integrate all that heterogeneous policy information into our modeling framework. So we need to become more systematic about this. Because it's also about the relevance of our scenarios one approach here that is followed generally is to think about, can we collect, for example, as a service to the community in a regular way policies and then make them available to the integrated assessment community as a data source for implementation, so that we can increase the development cycles or accelerate the development cycles and make our tools more relevant. And in the same time also establish perhaps a continuous some sort of live scenario explorer where everybody can submit the most recent generation of scenarios into a community scenario database where we have an annual vetting process, and each year we would identify the set of scenarios which are consistent with the most recent trends and which also include the most recent policy information. And that would help us to identify knowledge gaps, and it would also help us to be better prepared ahead of AR7, a little bit what Jim mentioned earlier, to have an ongoing process from which AR7 can basically benefit from. And some of the projects have actually already started to do this, like, for example, the Elevate project is establishing a live database. Ultimately, a vision could be for us as a community that we have basically this live database with continuous scenario inputs and an annual or biannual vetting process, and tagged on that or bolt on different modules for post-processing the information of the integrated assessment models to increase the utility for different user groups. This could be, for example, the working group 1 climate pipeline to generate climate information consistent with our scenarios that are consistent with AR6. But this could be national downscaling approaches. This could be impact emulators that are connected to such a database, or an investment assessment, equity interpretation of the scenarios, so that when the scenario is run, people understand there are different underlying equity assumptions which would be consistent with one specific scenario if you vary assumption about who, for example, is financing the investments which is happening in different regions. So I think we would benefit a lot from this type of infrastructure, but it requires also not only coordination within the integrated assessment modeling community, but also collaboration with very different expert groups who could help us host perhaps some of those different add-on features to the scenario database. Thank you.
Thanks, Keywan. Great presentation. Yeah, so we would now move to the last two presentations, and they are about the activity that we have started last year on trying to update some of the key assumptions underlying the SSPs. The SSPs were made around 2012 to 2014. At that time, we used the data that was available at the time, so mostly from 2010. And by now, obviously, there's a lot of new information available. And last year, we discussed a bit how we could think of updating the SSPs. You can update the full framework, you can update the narratives, but you could, at the very least, you could update the quantifications. And we decided to do that first of all. And obviously, that would start with the demographics and the economics. And so the presentations, the updates that we are now able to give are, how are we with updating the demographic part of the SSPs? And after that, how are we doing with the economic part. And now the first presentation is by Samir KC from IIASA on the demographic update. Thank you.
Thank you, Detlef. So we have about 12 of our teams at IIASA and also at Shanghai University working on updating this projections for population and human capital. So what we did in 2013 was to have a population distribution such as this one for Asia in 2010. We actually did it country specific. I'm just showing the Asia, where we have population disaggregated by age and sex, but also by level of education. So here you see like 4 levels of education, with dark red being no education and dark blue being the post-secondary. But we actually do it by 6 levels of education, and in some countries there are also 8 levels of education. So we use this, we start with this distribution, and then we project it such that we will get population distribution in the future. And when we do that, well, this is a basic matrix that can explain what we have. So we have the demographic characteristics, age, sex, education, and country. And then when we move into the future, we need fertility, mortality, international migration, and the education transition. So these are the 4 components of change in our model. So each of these boxes needs to be worked out, prepared data and all. So this was done in, so I call it Wittgenstein WIC 2013-14/14. That's the SSPs that you find in the SSP database at IIASA. But we have been continuously updating our projections. So in 2018, we did our update and available in our website, but not yet into the SSP database. But it's already now 10 years. So as Detlef said, we have now almost finalized the update. So why do we need to update it? In the last 1 decade, I'll just show you how things have changed. So this first graph is about births per women. We call it total fertility rates for 2015-2020. So when we did our projection in 2013, the values for 2015 and 20 were projections. So we were expecting some, some TFRs, total fertility rates in the future. But now we are already in 2022, and we can have a look at what are the estimates for 2015-20. And UN has just in July published their revision. And this graph shows that, in the x-axis, you see what we projected for 2015-20. And then in the y-axis, you see the UN estimates. And then the line that you see, that's a 45-degree angle slope 1 line. So we see that, well, at the lower fertility group, they were all over the place, a bit lower than expected. But the surprise for us was that in many countries where there are higher fertility levels, the fertility didn't decline as much as we were expecting. So this was one reason which clearly makes us, to do this update. And the second graph is on the life expectancy at birth. So these are the period life expectancy, which means like if somebody experiences the birth rate, mortality rate, age-specific mortality rates of today, what would be the average life that person would live? And here also you see that it's mostly the positive thing here, that you see that the countries with higher life expectancy, so they are kind of distributed kind of randomly, like at the upper right corner. But on the lower right corner, you will see this, all these parts for, by the way, all of these are for countries. Okay, 1 point is for each country, sorry for that. But for life expectancy, you see that as there is a positive news that a lot of countries have a much higher life expectancy than what we expected in 2013. And the main reason here is the success of, Gates Foundation effort and lots of other institution effort of saving children. So under 5 mortality rates were better. So if you save a child, the overall life expectancy really increases highly. And at the same time, the AIDS mortality, the success of AIDS mortality also is the story there. So because of this reason, I think it's a high time to do the projection. So we are doing the update, almost finalizing. But at the moment, we are kind of stuck or, validating the migration assumption, because for some countries, migration is very sensitive, especially the Western countries, population would otherwise decline in those countries, and migration is really keeping it high. And then when we updated our migration assumption with the latest data available, we found some surprises. That's why I won't be showing any country-specific results, but at the global level, it doesn't matter, right? At the global level, so I will show you some global level results. So at the moment, we are validating our migration assumption, SSP2. Yeah, first the focus is on SSP2. While we are, and then for this round, we are long-term assumptions. We are not changing much. Yeah, but in some cases we have to, but otherwise we are not changing much. So as a result, it's might be a surprise for you. What would be the implication of this change? We see that 9.4 billion that we were expecting as a peak population in our SSP 2013, it will be crossing 10 billion. So that might have an impact on your calculations and all, but this is what we see. And the main reason, as I explained, is because of mostly the mortality story is a positive story, but the fertility, most of the countries, the government wants to have lower fertility. Yeah? So there is, in some countries that didn't happen. And Pakistan is, for example, one country, but there are lots of African countries as well. So I saw these results. This is a preliminary result. So you can already see this is the population of the world. And at the beginning, you can already see that I didn't have a pointer, it doesn't work. I don't know how it works, but at the beginning, you already see that the line that is in the lowest one, that is our SSP 2013. And then the top line is the one from the UN current projection. UN were actually going to 11 billion, but this time they have brought down to 10.5 billion as a peak. So our SSP were below, it was like 9.4 billion. It's there, but then the triangle one, the second from the down, is the 2018 update. We had a bit higher population, but now we have much higher than what we had in the last update. So 1 billion more people at the end of the century. So that's the news here. And then very quickly, why? Like the big story here is that the birth number of this graph is about number of births, global births. This is a 5-yearly births, okay? Because we do our projection in 5-yearly time steps. So you see that the births, the bottom 2 lines are our old SSPs, but in this update with the new fertility and all, we see that the decline in global births will be delayed. And it's mostly because of countries like Pakistan, there is DR Congo, and there are lots of other countries that is kind of that the fertility didn't decline as we were expecting, and as a result of that, it's kind of going bigger and bigger. Yeah. In terms of the total deaths, the story is there is not so much of difference. Some differences there, so I will quickly skip this. And of course, the COVID-19 deaths are included, but not in these graphs. But the assumption, mostly the UN and ours, is that the impact would be temporary, and so we will come back to the normal death pattern. This is the result. Again, it's a preliminary. So this is from the top one is 2020, 50, and 2100. The world will have the more population, but more educated and more, let's say, elderly, I would say. Yeah, the aging would continue. And then these are some points about what are the main, like in our demographic community, what we are discussing about the future. When we are talking about the future, we talk about the rate of what should be the assumption for the future. Migration is the most difficult for us. Well, fertility and mortality, we kind of are quite, like we kind of know what will happen. Of course, uncertainty is always there. But our biggest challenge is migration and what kind of assumption would be called SSP2. I mean, of course, we have our assumption for the first SSPs. So we are checking those. And also the big challenge for us to answer the question about the upper limit of the life expectancy, how far it could go. And for the fertility, it is the other way. What is the lower limit of the life expectancy? Because we recently saw that in South Korea, as a country, they had fertility rate of 0.81 children per woman. And the top of that, we have education differentials. So while this will be an update, we are also planning for the revision of the whole thing, like the long-term vision, long-term demographic futures and all, and also to include the 2020 round of census. The data will be coming out in the next 2, 3, 4 years. So in the next 5 years, we are already planning to do a major revision of our demographic model. So these are this is my final slide. Well, nothing important, they're just trying to put them together. And then the last point is maybe important that we try to finalize it by January 2023, but we have been saying that since 8 months, right? The last one was March 2022. We said we'll finish. We couldn't yet.
Yes. I heard earlier this week somebody said that you should never trust a modeler on timelines. But great presentation. So the last presentation is by Elisa LANZI, and that's on the economic projections, and Elisa is from the OECD.
Thanks very much. I'm very happy to be here today to provide an update on the SSPs for the economics projection. I'm presenting on behalf of the team. I'm not working on it alone. In terms of why are we doing this, there's been, of course, a lot that's been going on that justifies an urgent update of the economic projections. Amongst other things, there's been changes in the role of trade as an engine for economic growth, changes in volatility of resource prices, and then, of course, the big shocks to the global economy in terms of COVID and the Ukraine war. So we're working on updating the GDP projections. We're updating all drivers of the projections and all data that are behind the projections, but we are not updating the storylines or changing the modeling framework. In terms of what data exactly we're updating, it's the population data. So Samir just presented an update on that, but also labor markets, the short-term GDP forecast. And here I'd like to say that we've updated to fall 2021, but we've skipped spring 2022 updates because they were too uncertain with the Ukraine war. And we want to update to the fall 2022. So with the timeline of SAMIR's providing demographic projections in January 2023, we'll also take into account the 2022 fall short-term GDP forecasts. We're updating energy data. And finally, the long-term baseline projections from the OECD will update to a fall 2022 update if there is one, and otherwise adapt the fall 2021 ones. Just to give you an idea of what I mean when I say we're updating the data, but also rerunning the model. This slide currently shows the original SSP's projections for 2 countries with different income levels. It's the US and Ghana. If we were to only update the data and not touch the growth rates, so just apply the old growth rates to the updated data, this is what we would have. And as you can see, it doesn't look very reasonable. We would have Ghana with super high income levels, much higher than the US in some instances. So this is what we would have more reasonable if we're updating also the more recent data, the 2020 ones. But this is what we have with the full update, and it goes back to being reasonable. So this is why it's taking a while, because we're updating the demographic projections and also rerunning the model. So it's not a simple data update. Yeah. So I'll just show you some preliminary results, but we still need to do a couple of updates, as I said. So this is the short-term income growth rates for SSP2 in the original SSP projections, and this is what we have now. So as you can see, it's a big difference, mostly due to COVID. And as I said, we'll update to also include the Ukraine war, which you can't see right now. When you look at the long-term income growth rates, the projections, the updated projections are fairly similar in the long run to the old ones. That's because we haven't revisited the assumptions on the SSPs or the modeling framework. There are some differences in the short term, of course, and then in the medium term, which is reasonable because of the short-term changes. It's of course important to keep in mind that even small changes to the growth rate can lead to much bigger changes in terms of income level projections, which is what this slide shows. And overall, we have that the updated projections are a bit higher, which is also linked to SAMIR's revisions of the demographic projections, which are higher. If we, so far I've shown differences between the old and the new projections. This slide provides an overview of the updated SSP projections without a comparison to the previous. And what you can see here is that the updated projections reflect the SSP storylines. So you can see, for instance, an SSP3 with much lower growth rates. Some regions are actually quite flat in terms of growth changes. You have an SSP5 with higher growth rates and so on and so forth. So we're quite happy with the update. It's reflecting what we wanted to achieve. There are some wiggly lines, as you can see. Those are the sensitivity issues in the migration projections that Samir referred to. So we'll be revising those. So for us, it's let's say going on track, even if we are a bit late as well. So in terms of the next steps, we aim to work on the projections, as I said, updates to the full 2022 OECD and IMF short-term forecasts. Then we'll take time and, of course, update the new demographic projections. We'll take time to really check the SSPs. It's what we did last time, go really country by country and take the time to check that the projections are reasonable. And then the idea is to circulate to the community so that we can also receive feedback so that you can flag issues and then we can finalize and revise again. And then one thing we'd like to do is work a bit more on short-term uncertainties, as they've proven quite important with the latest events. And maybe just in reference to Keywan's presentation, who was saying that it'd be good to have more timely updates or more updates in any case. We have, since the last SSP version, updated our model regularly to the OECD and IMF short-term forecast, for instance, or actually to the UN demographic projections. So that's something that we would, of course, be willing to contribute to as well. Thanks very much.
Yeah, many thanks. We have time for about 2-3 questions. So if there are questions from the audience.
Thank you for the very useful insights and updates. VUUREN from Penn State. I want to ask a question about the coupling between working group 2 and 3, and more broadly to use how can we use scenarios for impact assessment. So a lot of the impact assessment on energy burden or health should be conducted at a much finer resolution, temporally and also spatially, comparing with what IAM could provide. And my group, for example, we struggle a lot thinking about are we making consistent assumptions in downscaling the energy system and the social demographic system, and also the emissions, for example. And on top of that, we're also thinking about are these like assumptions, downscaling assumptions, consistent with those more macro level input into the IAM. So I'm curious about the thoughts from the panelists thinking about those assumption consistency issues when doing the impact assessment. Thank you.
Thanks. Let's collect if there are more questions. Yes, go ahead. Oh yeah, Elmar, and then.
Yeah, maybe just briefly. So I wanted to pull on the string that Jim laid out in his talk, which is that a lot of the discussions around our scenario results focus on are they equitable, are they fair, et cetera, et cetera. And there are certain qualities of fairness and equity that I think we as a community from the IAMs can address. But a lot of that question is embedded in the underlying socioeconomic assumptions that drive the scenarios in the first place. And so I was curious to what extent equity is considered in some of the updated socioeconomic projections, and if it's possible to, or what you think, is it possible to develop quote unquote fair demographic projections and socioeconomic projections? Thanks.
Thanks, great question.
Yeah, thank you for the report on the updates. Question to Elisa. Is it fair to say that you are treating the current shocks as purely short term and then continue with rather high growth rates? Because there are some indications that it could be more long lasting, unraveling of global supply chains, the momentous changes in China, probably stifling innovation and productivity there for a longer time. So I was surprised that they're still so high, also going out to 2030, 2040. Could you say something on this?
Yes, thanks. Is there any other question? Because otherwise I go back to the form. Okay. Okay, yes, please.
Yes, sorry, very quick. This is Yang from PNL. So I just want to hear about your comments about like how we think about how this realistic scenario will be. How realistic, like RCP 8.5, is this still realistic at all, or whether 1.5 degrees still alive? This is something people very interested to hear.
Okay, great, thanks. So maybe Keywan, you could take the one on the impact.
Yeah, I think that's really crucial and very important question. How would we go about the different possible ways to establish emulators for impacts? So also here, I think it's useful to think about how the climate community was doing this for the climate emulators. So there was multiple rounds within the assessment to basically do a vetting and a qualitative evaluation whether the climate emulator is actually consistent with the more complex ESM, the Earth system models, or not, and different. And there are many different dimensions, and there are actually many people in this room who know this much better than me. And I think you can have similar processes here as well, right? So there are different sets of damage functions that are used in existing emulators. There are different ways of use, for example, the country scale SSP data and even the income distributions to better understand from downscaled population information where the vulnerability and exposure will be, and how that vulnerability and exposure to different events can change in the future if you bring spatial impact information together with spatial socioeconomic information. But the key here, I think, is really to have a community vetting process where you establish those standards and you also understand on which dimensions you will not be robust in terms of the downscaling and upscaling. Also, the aggregation is important, and which other dimensions not. And thinking back about the working group 1 and working group 3 collaboration, this also strengthens the ties and understanding across the working groups. So I think it's also a very healthy process.
Okay, thanks. So Samir and Elisa, could you reflect on both on the question on equity and the long-term growth rates?
Thank you, Matt. I think in our projection model, we have this, like education and mortality future, the projections, right? So most of it is very positive. So there is like convergence to like the gain in life expectancy, like how much you will be following the Japan, for example. Japan has this 2 years gain per decade of life expectancy. And basically that is driving most of the projection, the medium scenario that we have for SSP2. So and also we have the education component in our projection, which is also called global education trend scenario. Is quite optimistic. Other than that, I think yeah, we haven't considered too much of this. For example, in case of fertility, when you think of fertility, lots of places with low development areas have a higher level of fertility, and if you want to bring that down and call it like a positive development, then there is this educating women is one of the things which comes through our education scenarios, which is, as I said, optimistic one. The other one that we have to consider, which we are considering in some way, is the contraceptive prevalences of providing contraceptives to contraceptions, easily accessible, affordable contraceptions. And that is there implicitly, but not very explicit. So overall, because we are following this demographic transition theory, which kind of predicts that the fertility will go down. Right, and so we are following that, and those are kind of taking that theory is taking care of this other than the education one. Other than that, we haven't done. But for example, SSP4, where we have thought a lot about that, and where you will see within a country there is like one group is really having higher level of fertility, well, enjoying more, and the other one is not.
Elisa?
So in terms of consideration of fairness and equity questions, the economic model we use is based on a conditional convergence setup, so that you have higher growth in lower income countries in general. So to that respect, that type of progress is taken into account. Otherwise, the fairness and equity part of, let's say, the SSP storylines were taken into account in the original discussions on how to differentiate across SSPs, and those were not updating. So we haven't updated that part. It remains the same. Concerning if we're only tweaking the short term and not the long term as well, no, we're tweaking both. I mean, the main thing is the short term, because that's where the largest differences are, but we are updating the whole projections. The reason I believe for which the GDP projections are higher is that we are currently using the post-COVID economic projections, which were all based on how the recovery packages will boost the economy, which will boost the short term, but then also the long term. So they're very optimistic. I think they will change quite a bit now that we do the update to full 2022, which has changes to the short term, but also I think the long term will be revised substantially. And the last thing is the energy part will need revisions, and those would also affect, especially for some key countries, the projections.
Yeah. Both factors might be something that we want to look into during the review. I've already noted that because of the relatively low economic growth in developing countries in the historical period, that now in the long term, you see a larger income gap in SSP2 than we had earlier. And we might want to consider whether we want that, for instance. Then the last question was on RCP 8.5 and the 1.5 and whether they are still realistic. Maybe Bas or Jim, you would like to say something on this?
Yeah, follow up, please. But I want to refer you to at least and also watch. Basically, now that the talks on the scenarios forum are online, watch my plenary presentation on the last day, because that was about how we keep those ranges up to date. And RCP 8.5, we basically have diverged. We were very long on the high end of the ranges of emissions, but since 2015, we've basically diverged from the highest end of the range. And with that, in that 7-year period, basically RCP 8.5 has become increasingly unlikely, of course, and sort of way too high at this point. On the low end, on the 1.5, I think it's a question of whose call is it to say that it's no longer it's no longer attainable, right? At some point, it won't run anymore in our models, but well before it doesn't run anymore in our models, the scenarios look from a feasibility assessment quite extreme and unrealistic. And does that mean that we should no longer provide them because we think it's too extreme? Or should we provide that information to policymakers and let them make up their minds, give them the tools also to make that assessment, come to that conclusion themselves? Like, well, maybe this is a bit too extreme.
Jim?
Yeah, if I can come in as well, Detlef. Just to say on the RCP 8.5, looking at it from the perspective of our working group 2 colleagues, they do need a high-end scenario, in which to do their impact and adaptation assessments. The trouble is that RC 8.5 is right for the wrong reasons at the moment, and I think another approach to that may be needed. If I were planning long-term infrastructure and worrying about the future, I would be worrying about a high-end emissions scenario, which is lower than the current RC 8.5 at the moment, but I'd also be worrying about more extreme terms in terms of climate sensitivity. So you're worrying about the kind of a precautionary worst case. And I think that would be a really interesting thing to look at in terms of scenario architectures for AR7. The dreaded 1.5 question, which I've had microphones stuck in front of my mouth since the 1.5 report on that. And my line was always, it's possible within the laws of chemistry and physics. And I wouldn't change that kind of response to it at the moment. But as Bas says, it is getting much more demanding. And there was one interpretation that came out of COP27 that worried me a bit, that relates to the granularity of the timescales in the integrated assessment models, which move in 5-year jumps. Now, what our models said is that to be compatible with 1.5, all of the scenarios have lower emissions in 2025 than they are in 2020, which was then interpreted as saying that emissions must peak before 2025. Now, the governments have grasped onto that like pulling on a straw and think that if emissions peak before 2025, but emissions are still higher in 2025 than in 2020, we may still be on track for 1.5. This is not true. And so I think how we communicate these things, I think we need to be very, very, very careful about. And obviously, the longer we go on emitting 50 odd gigatons a year of carbon dioxide equivalent, the less and less likely it becomes.
Yeah, thanks. And maybe on that same issue, I think making sure that we communicate well what we mean with scenarios is critically important. RCP 8.5, when it came out, was already described as a very high-end, less likely scenario. Still, some communities started to use it as more or less as a baseline. And maybe it's also our responsibility to sometimes ourselves respond in the literature and indicate what we were meant with scenarios and how they are used. Okay, I would like to end this session, sorry, because we're already a little bit over time. I think it was a great session. I think we have learned a lot again, and we have lunch until 2, and then we restart again. Thanks.